Welcome to Beyond the Hub, where we talk about everything from sales to marketing to your business as a whole. And today we're going to be talking about education in your business. So
Mhm.
I'm excited to have Jorie Munroe, Senior Inbound Professor at HubSpot Academy, join us. Jorie is more than your average professor. She crafts engaging educational content. You deliver worldwide workshops, lead your own podcast. And I like to say that your classroom isn't confined by walls. It extends to businesses everywhere. So super
Wow.
excited to have
Yeah.
you
The
today.
accolades. I don't even know if I can follow that up.
We'll get it all
Fair.
written down for you. You can put it on a
Yeah,
t-shirt.
exactly. Just
Really
coming to
excited to have you
Inbound
here.
near you.
I think we should start with the why. So you obviously witnessed firsthand the power of education in businesses. Why do you think that continuous learning is so important?
Yeah, definitely. So I feel like on a meta level, like HubSpot aside, Academy aside, continuous learning in business is so important today because today's competitive landscape and technological landscape is super fast paced, right? It's changing constantly. And how you reach and resonate with customers, with leads, with prospects, that's also changing super fast, right? So
Mhm.
if you're not committing to really staying ahead of today's trends, how user behavior has changed, how users' buying behavior has changed, I think you risk sort of falling behind and honestly not being able to be as competitive in your role. I
Mm.
think from a skills sort of development side, you also need to make sure that you're upskilling in your own career to like from a personal growth standpoint, just to make sure that like you're able to remain competitive in your own job. I think that what marketing looks like now is very different from when a lot of us first joined our careers, right? Like I think back to even just when I started kind of operating in the marketing space, like 2017 and 2024 are completely different beasts. And,
Yeah.
if you're not reskilling regularly, like you're not really preparing yourself for like the job of tomorrow. And really like looking ahead. And then also like again, I work primarily like in the marketing space, but I think that continuous learning gives you sort of like continuous learning makes sure that you're constantly consuming and interacting with new concepts and ideas. And I think from a creative standpoint, that also makes it easier to be creative because you're like looking at what's out there and then trying to personalize it to like what your unique audience may like. I think honestly continuous learning makes it so that you can think out of the box more, and get a little bit more creative with your own problem solving. It's not always like, well, I'm seeing it done this way and I'm going to one translate that and copy that campaign. But it's like, but maybe I get inspired by how I'm seeing other people do it and then, adapt that to the needs of my own audience. So to sum that up, I guess it's remaining competitive for your business, in your career, and then also making sure that you're constantly refreshing your own sense of creativity by seeing sort of like the unique ways that you could be, proceeding with your own marketing. So, key driver of success, super underutilized in some spaces, but really important if you're going to stay ahead.
I love that you brought it back to us as individuals, because I think when people think like continuous learning, it's all about the business, but actually it starts much lower than that. It starts with us.
Yeah.
Then it benefits the business after that, doesn't it? It's about us as people first.
Definitely. And I sort of almost think about it like a wonky inequality where it's like you need to also make sure that like you're set in your space before you can solve for your team, before you can solve for the business, before you can solve for your customer. So
Yeah.
you really need to get to the root first. And of course, when businesses think about learning, it might be sort of like backwards planning that. But like us as marketers or us as sales reps, like we need to start with making sure we're competitive in our own job and looking out for our own selves. So I think that, yeah, there's definitely like a personal and professional reason to be seeking out continuous learning and always be growing that way.
I think some people and some businesses can be a bit nervous that they'll make mistakes, they'll do something wrong. So, are there any common pitfalls to avoid when you're like implementing an education program, for example, in a business?
Yeah. So Honestly, the biggest one that I see, especially when I talk to like businesses like at Inbound and just like
Mhm.
in casual conversation, is when businesses are starting to implement an education program, sometimes they have a lack of goals. And I know that can sound kind of like vague at first because it's like, what do you mean goals? But I think that it's really important that if you're trying to train your team on something, whether that's a strategy, a tactic, you know, something they should be doing in their day to day that they might not know how to do now, you really should have a very clear sense of like what the objective of them learning that particular skill is, because I think that where a lot of education programs die is because there's like a general like sense of confusion or lack of direction of like what it's actually trying to accomplish. So what I recommend businesses do is honestly almost craft a purpose statement of, if you're going to carve out time from your employees day or week or quarter, if you're going to make them interact with like mandatory training materials, they should have that sense of why. It should be so crystal clear what you're trying to accomplish by having them navigate this training. And again, that could be so simple as like, I want you to be able to absolutely nail your prospecting calls all the time. Therefore, I'm making you take some of Kyle's education, right, on Academy. Or I want you to really understand the social media marketing landscape so that you have creative ideas the next time we need that for a marketing campaign, right? Like there should be almost a learning objective to bracket your own educational program. Again, independent of HubSpot Academy, it should just exist in your program so that also when your employees or your team members come to you and are like, why are we doing this? Or if you need executive buy-in to even carve out that time from their schedule, it's so crystal clear, like, this is how we're going to solve for the employees skill gap so that we
Mhm.
can ultimately solve for the customers, or this is how we're going to solve for our employees skill gap so that we can enrich them in their career, right? Like regardless of like what that endpoint is, you shouldn't leave people guessing. And I see that as like that lack of goals, like the main pitfall to avoid. Another is like, if you don't have that clear sense of purpose, sometimes on like the employee side, there's a bit of a resistance to change that you might start to bump up against. And again, your purpose statement, your mission statement, your vision statement of your educational program can help to start to counteract that, and make sure that, yeah, your employees get excited because they understand why they're there. Um, I think that sometimes like people are like, they get a little nervous when there's this sense of continuous learning because, they want to be high performers and they want that like perspective that like, oh, I'm of course like the highest performer on the team, I know everything, I know how to do my job. So there can be a little bit of like an insecurity that you need to address when saying, actually, we need to all upskill together, because it is implying a gap or a lacking. But again, I think that teams that learn together grow together, and if you really lean into like, this is how we're all collectively making sure that we stay ahead, that can also address any resistance you might find on the team.
I really like that. And you mentioned there about carving out time. And that's another thing that people are always really like, I don't have the time for this. I don't think it's worth me carving out the time. I think egos can maybe get in the way of carving out that
Yeah.
time. But do you have any tips for people, business leaders, teams,
Sure.
on how to make that a regular habit?
Yeah, so couple of thoughts there. I think along with setting clear goals, with those goals, you should start thinking about like, how are you going to prioritize the relevant topics, right? Like, and if that's strategic or tactical, you want to make sure that you're always focusing and having your team train on things that are relevant to your current challenges and actual areas of improvement. You don't want to just like say like you're learning for the sake of learning. There should be, again, that endpoint. Um, so definitely prioritizing the most relevant or like mission critical, for lack of a better word, topics that your team needs to know like now, in the next quarter, in the next 2 quarters, by the end of the year. And
Mhm.
then from there, I honestly think the best next tactic would be to schedule dedicated learning time. So that's actually how World Certification Week started, right? There was an agency that wanted to really dedicate itself to, I believe it was SmartBug, to continuous learning of their employees. And that helped inspire conversations, even just like in HubSpot, where it was like kind of inspiring to see them like
Yeah.
set aside time. And then that really gained traction. You can imagine HubSpot Academy, always learning. We have all of these like taglines that are like teams that learn together grow together and always be learning. But the best thing that folks can do is make sure that like if this is truly important to you and if there's really a skill gap that you are dedicated to addressing, that you should actually carve out time that's like during this time nothing else happens besides people taking videos, people listening to educational podcasts. That's honestly learning time. What that can look like is obviously going to be dependent on the team.
Mhm.
There are teams that I think do really effective sessions that it's like an hour a week on Friday, right? There are teams that take entire days out, but it's once a quarter, and that's the training day, and they follow a similar regimen. Honestly, it would take evaluating how your current business process works to identify the best time to be putting your team or parts of your team or even just a single person on your team through dedicated learning time. But I think you have to start scheduling it because then it becomes a habit. And once it's a habit, then it becomes ingrained in the culture. Um, so it has to start very intentional. I think along the way, an important thing too is that you should be listening to employee feedback, right? Where it's like, if you're scheduling too much learning time that they feel like they can't be effective, well, that's no good, right? You want to make sure that their perspective is incorporated also into the cadence that you're looking to train people or encourage continual learning on. Um, so always think about that too. But they could find like you could find that actually it got people really empowered. It got people really inspired. And maybe you should consider adding more time, right? So if you're moving from a quarterly, maybe it becomes like a monthly thing where, again, it can be in as little as 30 minutes, especially with the way that certain micro learning content has been taking off. I think specifically about like YouTube in that way. Or again, the many online course catalogs that you can access these days. So it doesn't have to be, I think that's also another thing that we have to like sort of demystify is that like continuous learning doesn't have to be a whole training day. If you can dedicate that time, that's wonderful and that's amazing. But
Mhm.
there are going to just be teams that like sometimes all you need is 30 minutes. It can be something that happens asynchronously, right? When people can get to it, or it could be something that you bring the whole team together to review and sort of create engagement that way. What it looks like doesn't have to be so cookie cutter and like, well, this company does it this way or this company does it that way. Um, but I think like talking to your team, setting aside a piece of dedicated time that works for them. And then just running with it, right? Seeing if it works and iterating as you do with all good processes can be honestly the best way to start to bake it in.
I like what you said there about it's not cookie cutter, like it's not a one size fits all. And I guess that comes down to the content as well, right? So if
Mhm.
people, there's obviously like HubSpot certifications, there's things like Sandler training, and like, there's so much out there. But if you want to create your own internally because they don't fit
Mhm.
what you're looking
Mhm.
for, what advice would you give for crafting that from scratch?
So to peel back the layers a little bit, how all HubSpot Academy professors think about education is through this model called ADDIE, right? So it's an acronym. It stands for, let me see if I can get this right: analyze, design, develop, implement, evaluate. And so it's this instructional design model that focuses on how adults learn things and honestly memorize them so they can implement them. So my first recommendation would be to not create in a silo because there are some amazing frameworks out there that will help you think about how to translate content into true education and learning that make it so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I think that frameworks like that can help you kind of get into the correct mindset on like how people actually learn
Yeah.
and like cement certain concepts. And I think that's something that's often looked over, regardless of the exact framework you use as you're starting to think about like actually developing, because that's more of like a logistics side. Um, the most important thing is that from the very first moment you start like putting pen to paper or start scripting something out on your computer, you want to make sure that you're clearly defining your learning outcomes so that you can ultimately achieve it in your educational content, right? So you want to start thinking really deeply through like what are the skills and what is the knowledge gap that this team or my employees have, and use that to guide everything else in your content creation. I think that where people start to go wrong when creating their own education is they just immediately start creating it. And my advice is actually to slow down. You want to start with what you want to accomplish and then backwards plan your content from there. Part of that is also knowing your audience, right? So you need to really understand like what their preferences in terms of formats. There's so many formats that you could use to deliver your education. But you also need to understand like what their knowledge level is, and that's going to also inform how you make it engaging, right? So if you know everyone on your team knows what a landing page is, you don't want to spend 45 minutes defining like why a landing page is important or what a landing page is or what one looks like. You need to dive into like actually tailoring the content to be relevant and engaging for them. So that really requires just knowing that base level of where your team is at.
Yeah.
And then again, like using the variety of formats, right? Like I think that Academy really goes to videos a lot, but like there could be many different interactive ways that you're like creating this for your own team, right? Like it could be a doc, it could be a video, it could be an audio snippet, it could be case studies, infographics, screenshot examples, videos embedded onto a training dashboard, right? Like it could look like however you need it to be. Like it could look like whatever format it needs to be in order for your team to actually use it. Um, and then yeah, make it practical, right? Like I think it's really easy to get lost in the why and the strategic, this is why we're doing it, this is what this initiative is. But you also want to make sure that like if you're creating like content for your own team, education for your own team, they're able to do something after that. So also use that as a guardrail of like making sure it's very easy to translate each piece of your script or each piece of your content into a direct action. Okay, so after they read this paragraph, what can they do? If it's not very clear, you want to make sure you're evaluating that piece of content to make that tie a little bit stronger. You don't want to create content just for the sake of content, and I promise your team doesn't want to consume content for the sake of content.
I guess when you do it
So
like
yeah.
that, it cements it in their
Mhm.
brains as well, doesn't it? Like you can read a whole document, but unless you actually put it into practice, you
Yeah.
might lose that.
Definitely,
How,
yeah, and that's also where feedback does come in, right? Like, uh, don't create this educational content in a silo. Really make sure you're gathering feedback from your learners all the time. If you're making them go through it, start to evaluate, like, is there anywhere that I could have been more interactive or more clear, or based on this training, do you feel like you can accomplish XYZ task, right? Because also one thing that is constantly being brought up on Academy, and I would encourage people to think about it in their own educational content, is just like there is always room for iteration and listening to learner feedback to make
mm,
sure that it is as effective as it can be, that it is helping accomplish those learning outcomes as you've stated them. So if you find like uh you launch this new training and none of the people that go through it can actually accomplish what you want them to accomplish, maybe it's back to the drawing board, right? Like you got to
something
let go
went
of that
wrong.
ego, and like you got to think about like, okay, it's for the team, not for you creating beautiful content, you know? So yeah, you always need to sort of close that loop, which is why that ADDIE framework is like so important, because evaluation of the training is part of the model. So again, you don't have to use that, but it is a good way to think about the full scale, because it is a bit of a life cycle when it comes to learning content, from development all the way to evaluation and honestly redevelopment.
Exactly. And you kind of mentioned it there about if they haven't learned by the end, if they can't do what you set out, then you need to change it. But actually getting them to do the training in the first place sometimes can be a
Yeah.
struggle. So how can people make it fun? Because people are
Yeah.
going to do it if it's fun, aren't they?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind with like actually getting people to free education besides like making it mandatory, is I really encourage people to gamify
Yeah, I love
the training as much as possible, right? So it's like there's a couple different ways that you could bring sort of those like gamey fun elements into your training, and some that sort of come to mind are like leaderboards, right? Like I think
it. They're
that
always good.
drilling into people's inherent competitive experience like is a great way to get people going and sort of like give bragging rights. Like it doesn't have to like lead to anything. It can be just bragging rights, and that sometimes is enough to empower teams to like complete things. You could do like points and reward systems like depending on you know, how you want folks to complete tasks or achieve certain milestones, right? Um you could have like a wall of fame. Again, if you didn't want like small prizes or something, how you see Academy do it, honestly, to encourage further learning is badges and achievements is like a big one, but you could create your own, right? Like, especially if it's not through Academy or it's like a couple different modules, you could create your badges and achievements, get little pins. Challenges is another good one. I think about this like you see it in like video games like side quests, right? But you could create like challenges throughout the year for your team to see, and especially like if there's like specific strategies or tactics, like that could be like a super fun challenge that everyone like engages with. So there's a couple different ways. Again, it also depends on sort of like the culture of your team, and what works for you in an office or what works for you, you know, virtually, but just the ways that you can sort of like make it almost like a game. I think you'll find more people will find it like fun and interactive that way. Uh, I know it's if like seeing how gamification works is still feeling like a little vague. Um, I think a really good example of a company that does this is like Duolingo, right? Like language learning is a bit of a slog, right? It can be really hard. It takes a lot of time to get really good at. And if you look at that app, though, they've done like a really amazing job of like doing like the big rewards and the big badges, but then also incentivizing the small steps. And what I think people can take away from that beyond Duolingo is a fun app, is really like also thinking about what are the big ways that you can reward your team or your employees, but what are also the small ways that you can make it easier along the way? Um, you talked about like HubSpot Academy educations, like the certificates, like sometimes those take hours to complete because they're pretty comprehensive, right? But like if that's the case and you want to make sure that your entire team, for example, has something long, like the sales enablement certification is a great example. Amazing content, bit of on the long side. How are you like rewarding them as they complete each lesson, right? Um, Even sometimes as simple as the like shout out in Slack, like you did it, that's
Oh,
amazing, like party emoji, can just create a bit more of that momentum. And so again, it doesn't have to be like physical rewards. Sometimes it's just like shout outs or highlights that can get people excited and engaged to complete it in their own right.
I think that's such an important thing to remember is that you're asking someone to do something that requires effort. So
Hmm.
don't just say, go do it, and then don't recognize that they've done
Yeah,
it.
like
They
they took
need
some
that.
time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it can work. And you mentioned the HubSpot certification. So there are loads. Is it
Are.
upwards? I want to say upwards of 40, or is it?
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's yeah,
40.
between yeah, I think it's upwards of 40, soon to be more coming soon.
Yeah, there's a lot. And it can be difficult to know how to prioritize because obviously you can do it by so many different ways. So what
Sure.
is your kind of advice on how to prioritize doing those?
Yeah, so I it depends on who's asking. So okay, so from
Honest.
the personal growth kind of area, right? I would say prioritize based on what your career goals are, right? So where do you want to take your career, and does that align with a certification? If that does, those are the certifications you should be taking. That includes like again assessing your own skill gaps, right? Where it's like I work in content marketing. I might not know as much about SEO. Take the SEO certification, right? Like, where are you feeling weakest and start there. I think along that lines from a personal perspective, you could also consider like market demand, like where is your industry going and how can you again set yourself ahead to be competitive in that landscape? I think knowledge is a very important resource to be leaning into as you consider the job market. So prioritize, the certifications that are valued by your employer or the employers you're trying to really impress in the future, align with the market needs there. I think also about there's this concept that like if that still feels kind of like, well, I don't know, Jory. There's also this concept that I've always really liked. It's a bit of an old one. I haven't heard it kind of get thrown around too much, but it's this idea of like the T-shaped marketer or the M-shaped marketer. So the idea here is that and this is something that I feel like I learned pretty early in my career that was pretty important to thinking about how I like made myself competitive at HubSpot, right? So this is more of like a personal Jory story.
Mhm.
But essentially the idea of the T-shaped marketer is like a bit like you need to get really good at being a generalist. So if you think about a T, right? The T part, so the broad stroke of the T, the top part, it sort of represents the breadth of knowledge you have. So you should be dangerous in a lot of different categories, things that might not even directly relate to your exact role. So things like data or things like psychology or things like A/B testing, right? Not things that are inherently like you're going to use in your day to day. Then the stem, I guess, of the
Backbone.
T sort of like represents the depth that you have in one or more areas, right? So that vertical bar is really going to be related to the skills and expertise of a single field. It could be a single channel. Um, but it allows you, if you start thinking about your skills in that kind of shape, to make sure that you have like a base knowledge in non-marketing specific areas, right? That will be skills that can help you regardless of your job. Then maybe you layer it in with like some marketing specific subjects that might be helpful across all marketing channels. But what you go deep on is that channel expertise that you're going to need to know to absolutely crush it in the type of marketing, for example, this is a good marketing example, that you're trying to build your career around. So if that is social media, uh, building your base layer and then really focusing on mastering social media. Or if that is search engine optimization, like making sure that you're truly mastering SEO strategies and where that market is going. So how that translates to HubSpot Academy certifications is like that base layer, that's inbound marketing if you are a marketer. Maybe even inbound marketing optimization, because those are going to be the certifications that enable you to have like the broadest stroke of like what's going on in the marketing industry. Then from there, it becomes a matter of like, okay, but like what kind of marketer, for example, are you? So if you work in SEO a lot, great, take the SEO certification. That's your T. If you work in ads, paid advertising a lot, digital advertising. If
Mhm.
you work in social media advertising. If you do multiple, well, think about taking those specialty certifications that whatever it is that aligns with what you're doing and where you want to go. I think that's going to be kind of the most strategic way to navigate the very many certifications because, like, yes, there's a big portfolio. You could take them all, but I also want to make sure that people are taking the ones that are the most relevant and valuable to them.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, and the same could be said for, sales, right? So it's inbound sales, maybe it's sales enablement, and then it's going deep, right? It's like the sales software certification, the different courses, and this is something people should be thinking about regardless of certification, but also courses and lessons, right? Like, what are the specialties in sales that you're trying to lean into? If it's being a successful sales manager, take the sales manager course. If it's being the be all end all admin for your HubSpot instance, great. Take like the sales admin course. Actually, I think that's a certification now. Anyway, but when you think about it that way, suddenly the portfolio doesn't seem so overwhelming. And honestly, that's how I would recommend people think about it individually. From a employer perspective, again, it's going to align with your business goals and what are the skills that are going to take your employees from skill gap to not skill gap. And then honestly just prioritize the tactical and strategic education that's going to get them there.
I was going to ask you for specifics when it came to certifications for
Sure.
business leaders. Do you think you kind of answered it there about how to be strategic around picking them, but do you think there are like like the top three that kind of every business leader should have, or does it depend?
Yeah. It depends, but it also doesn't. I think everyone should take absolutely the inbound certification just because there's a lot of like vocabulary almost that's established there and like strategic best practices that's established there that not that you couldn't understand the rest of the academy portfolio, but it's going to make it a lot easier, right? Because it's things like defining what a buyer persona is or defining what the flywheel is, right? Do you need those absolutely to understand something like the sales software certification? Not really, but then if there's a reference to a flywheel, you know what that is and you know contextually like how you should be then acting different.
Mm,
Um so I think inbound is the big one. And then again, depending on what kind of business leader you are, I would just say honestly, those generalist ones, inbound marketing and inbound sales are always a really good way to go. Just again, because it's going to give you a sense of how HubSpot is looking at marketing or sales through the lens of inbound. And that kind of just helps guide the rest of the ship in terms
mhm.
of what you'll see in the portfolio. The only small caveat that I would say on the sales side is to, if not inbound sales, consider the sales enablement certification. It's one that Kyle did a while ago, but it is so good. It is so good. We because of the sheer industry experts that he incorporated into that content. There's so much to be learned about connecting the dots between marketing and sales that's just housed in that certification specifically that marketing and sales leaders, I think, could just super benefit from. So that is one I would also recommend. Because you're also learning from people that have been in the industry for years. They're such experts. So don't let that content pass you by.
Yeah, I love that. And especially with World Certification Week well, we're in it now. So
Yeah.
people should definitely be looking at that. But we've kind of mentioned it only once before, but can you walk us through what World Certification is and how listeners can participate?
Definitely. Yeah. And I can also pull up the schedule too to give my recommendations, but essentially World Certification Week is a week-long event put on by HubSpot Academy and during this week, individuals or HubSpot partners are essentially extra encouraged to really learn and connect and grow by dedicating time to their skills development. For every HubSpot Academy certification that's completed during this week, HubSpot will donate $5 up to $25,000 to an education focused charity. Very humbled. This is something we're able to do. So this year, if you're taking a certification in North America, Europe, Africa, and I believe Asia as well, $5 will go for or to Teach for All, which is a education focused charity. If you're taking it in one of the Latin American countries, the $5 will go to Laboratoria, which is a amazing organization that does that work in that kind of region or in that region. And in addition to this awesome sort of like charitable component that comes with the week, we also are offering totally free online events throughout the week to get you excited about, yes, HubSpot Academy education, but also like industry best like practices right now.
Mm.
So there are a couple of AI ones that are on the calendar. There's several like professional development talks, and they're offered across all of the time zones that HubSpot operates in. So I think 5 major time zones. So the best way to get involved is honestly to get that certification, the one that you've been eyeing for a bit but may have not started yet, or the one that you're currently in progress and just need to make it to the finish line. But then I also encourage you to check out one of the many events. My team has done a lot of prep to make these events super awesome. I believe Tuesday is actually full of all day of events you can partake in. But definitely check the calendar if you're looking to upskill and attend a fun webinar put on by a HubSpot Academy professional.
I'll make sure to include all the links. I'll grab that off you in a minute and I'll put it in the show notes so that everyone can get to that.
Yeah.
That is all of my questions, but there is one final one that I wanted to ask.
Okay. Love to hear it.
Personally, what is your favorite certification from HubSpot Academy and why?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm a little biased, but I love the inbound marketing certification because it was the first certification that I ever took from HubSpot Academy. Like HubSpot Academy much predates me. And when I first joined HubSpot, it was mandatory that everyone take this certification. And at first I was like, ugh, this is online learning, but I loved it. It was so informative and helpful as I was like moving into my new position. And then it was also when I joined Academy, the first certification that I was a part of. So it has a bit of that sort of personal, sentimental kind of feel for me because it was like the first thing that really paved the way for me as a HubSpot Academy professor. So both from a learner and a creator perspective, IMC will always hold a special place in my heart.
I love that. I'm going to include a link to that one specifically below for everyone to go and check out as well.
Sure, yeah.
But thank you so much for taking the time today to chat
Yeah.
to us. It's been really great having you. And like I said, I'm going to put the links in. I'll put a link to Jorie's LinkedIn so you can all go and follow her. And also all the fantastic resources that we've mentioned as well. So make sure that you're learning, you're giving back, you're making a difference by doing Rad
Yeah.
Certification Week.
Getting those certs.
Exactly. And if you like this episode, make sure to subscribe. But that's all this week. Thanks,
Perfect.
Jorie.
Thanks for having me.